Right, so hello. Well, welcome back to the philosophy class, and my friends that I'm filming this for. It's Sunday evening, so it's my normal philosophy day. And today we're going to look at a new area of the periodic table. We've covered in previous classes the whole of the pale yellow, the philosophy per se, you know. And we've looked at Japanese face, we've looked at all the various pagan traditions, and we looked at Judaism. We looked at the Kabbalah in detail over a couple of sessions, and I think it's time we look at, and we looked at Buddhism in quite a lot of depth. I think it's important that we now turn towards Christianity, because it is numerically the most widespread of all the world's religions. It's had most influence really in the last couple of thousand years. So we're going to, I've coined the phrase the Christianities, plural. I don't think there's such a thing as Christianity. There are so many different varieties and blends of Christianity. And I've got a whole library wall full of books on all of them. You know, I've studied this thing for 20, 30 years in depth, and I've taught it at universities and researched it, you know, and also engaged with it existentially. I find it fascinating. Because if you want to make sense of world history, because I did a degree in world history, so you have to know what Christianity is, you know, even if you're not religious, quote unquote. And then when I trained as a religious studies teacher in schools in the UK, well, traditionally the UK has a largely Christian history for the last, you know, nearly 2,000 years. So, of course, a lot of the kids were Christian or interested in it. So I've had to learn to teach Christianity in a way that doesn't offend them, respects their views, but also asks complex questions about the origins of Christianity. And so, so that's really, why is it important? That's the first point I want to make. Because of its numerical strength, I mean, there are 2 billion, apparently, Christians on the planet. And in the periodic table, I go into all the different denominations and I explore the numbers. So, for instance, in my mother's family, the Clough family from Yorkshire, we were what's called Baptists, which means they were Protestants, from about the 1600s. I have a family tree going back to the 1600s of these Protestant Baptist types, which was a movement at that time, 400 years ago, which said that these things are so important, you shouldn't get baptized as a child or a baby. That's ridiculous. You should make a mature decision as an adult to be baptized, and or not. And this was a big thing in Germany. There were Baptists, and also in Holland, I think, and in other parts of Europe and in Britain. And then it went to North America with immigrants that went over on ships and took these ideas. So anyway, that's one branch. Then I've also got an Anglican tradition in my own personal background, and that's another branch of the religious family of Christians. So the Anglicans, there's about 77 million in the world currently as we speak. In the whole of history, there have probably been about 700 million Anglicans. These are people that accept the idea that, you know, there is one universal Catholic Church, which is both Protestant and Catholic. And let's just have the king or queen as the head of it officially, and stop all the arguments and fights between Protestants and Catholics. So the Anglican idea was quite an intelligent idea, that because Europe was racked by Protestant Catholic conflicts for centuries. And if you say, no, we'll just have one state church and everybody belongs to that, and there are different wings of it, you can be like Catholic in your services or you can be more Protestant, but you all stay together, you know, in one church. I find that quite a nice idea. And that's why I myself was baptised into the Anglican Church as a mature person in my 20s at the University of London, because I wanted to show some solidarity with this tradition, which was my own heritage, And I found it, I wanted to become a Catholic, I wanted to be a Protestant, I wanted to be everything. So I thought the best thing is I'll just become the national church, and I was baptised at King's College Chapel at the University of London. And I was given this thing on the day by the vicar, this I've looked after it ever since. In 1987, on the 29th of April, I was baptised and confirmed on the same day, due to the chaplain at the LSE who talked me into it, because I was never baptised as a child, because my parents, I don't know, maybe, well, no, they thought this is too important, you should wait for yourself when you make your own decision. But I'd also spent a lot of time with Quakers. Now that's another group of Christians I have a lot of time for, number 46. They're fewer in number, only 360,000 probably. The Quakers I liked because their services consist of a silent meditation, like I do here every day. They do it for a whole hour every Sunday. And I used to go to Quaker meetings in Calgary, in Canada, where I first decided that this was a good thing. And every Sunday I went for like 2 or 3 years, and I set up a Bible studies class, which would meet before the service began. I was only like 22, but I thought, anyway, I like the Quakers, and they have a very strong commitment to non-violence and peace. They're like the yogis of the Christians. And that's how I got involved in peace work, because of my commitment to the Quakers. And they say, they were set up in the 1600s, they say that that's the original teaching of Jesus, that he was a peace activist, and he didn't agree with wars, and he didn't counsel his disciples to fight. He told Peter to put his sword away when he tried to defend him from the Roman soldiers who'd come to arrest him. And he accepted the crucifixion. I mean, he could have run away into the hills, he could have set up a guerrilla movement, he could have become an armed warrior, but no, Jesus wasn't into that. He was a peace person. And that is obviously so true if you read the Gospels. That, well, of course he was. So how come for nearly 2,000 years Christians have been very violent? How have they had armies killing each other if you're the wrong kind of Christian? Why would one group of Christians attack another group just because they worship in a different way? That's what's going on in Ukraine at the moment, and it makes me tear my hair out that some types of Christians are attacking other types. So it was to answer that question that I went back to London and studied world history, and I studied Christianity in depth as a problem to solve. Right? To me, it's like I'm a mathematician trying to solve the problem of why Christians are so violent in world history. Why did they go out and justify colonialism? Why did they conquer the North American Indian tribes? They hadn't hurt them. Why did they go and colonize it in the name of Christ? And then, do effectively genocide against the native peoples? Why did they do that in India and Africa? In South Africa, the Dutch and then the British sort of invented this kind of Christian racism, that the white Christians are better than the blacks, they're pagans, and we'll put them in little camps and make them live separate lives. And we're God's chosen people, and they're not. They're the devil's people. And this was a justification for slavery as well, during the long slavery period, when British and Dutch and other Portuguese and Spanish were all doing slavery in the name of Christianity, as if Christ would endorse that. I mean, haven't these people read the Gospels? There's nothing in there that seems to say that slavery is a good idea. Although it was part of the culture of the Roman Empire from which Christianity grew, but in my reading of it, Christ was part of the radical, liberal tradition which was opposing that imperialism and that colonialism. In the Christian theological world, that's called liberation theology, which is another box. It's a branch of mainly Catholic thinkers, but others, who say that no, Christ's teachings are about liberation, setting people free from first sin with themselves, but then from the sin of others, which is what slavery is about. I mean, there's no point me feeling, well, I'm saved, I'm going to heaven, but that slave guy that keeps whipping me, I mean, he's going to hell. No, it should be like, master and slave become free together in an authentic Christian thing. And that's what liberation theology is about. You've got to free the slaves, but also the oppressors from their own mentality. And that's kind of how I feel about Brexit, because that's the slaving mentality of the Brexiteers, who want Britain to be pure, best Britain, rules the waves, neo-imperialism again. And it's, some of it was buttressed on a pseudo kind of racial supremacy form of Christianity, which was Trump's argument in America, America first. White Americans, good Christians, all. We hate those horrible, the other. This is called othering. So anyway, so that's all by way of introduction. That's why this is important. This is like dynamite stuff. And we can say, well, I wish it wasn't, and I wish we were living in a Buddhist world, or I wish we were living in a Shinto world, or I wish we were living in a Druid world. But the trouble is, these pesky Christians, there's 2 billion of them, and we've got to deal with them. So what I'm going to try and do in this talk is bring some of the insights we've gained from the other religions to bear on our study of Christianity. Right. Okay, so that's why it's important. Basically, it's about stopping the world self-destructing. Right. How do we do it then? What do we need intellectually to make sense of Christianity? Okay, so we have to do something that's called biblical studies. Now, there are people that will say, no, we don't need biblical studies, you've just got to get faith. Read the Bible, read the New Testament, and get faith in Jesus. And that's it, end of story. You know everything there is to know about Christianity. I'm not saying faith isn't a good idea, and if you're someone watching this, or if one has faith, that's fine. But I'm saying faith and reason should be put together. I'm a believer in rationality and science and scientific method and reason and truth, because my abiding commitment is to philosophy, which is the reasoned analysis of theories about existence. And so we have to look critically at Christianity. And I follow Kant, who we saw in one of the classes when we looked at philosophy. Kant combined faith. He was from a pietist background, which was almost like a Quaker type of deep faith in spirituality, plus advanced philosophy and science and critical reasoning. It's possible to combine the two, and that's my view. And when I was baptized, it said here, what I pledged to when I signed it was I should try and follow the example of Christ in home and daily life, and to bear personal witness to him, to be regular in private prayer day by day, and to read the Bible carefully. Okay, so biblical studies is part of the thing I signed up for, and I think I've stuck to that. I've tried to, probably more than I've been fortunate and blessed to live the life of a scholar, so I've had time and leisure and opportunity to really throw myself deeply into biblical studies, and I'm going to be sharing the insights I've gained from this, what light it sheds on Christianity. So what is biblical studies? Okay, well, what is the Bible? Let's start with that. The Bible is the book that Christians swear by, most of them. And we'll see it's slightly complicated, but most mainstream Christians have read this or have one copy of it somewhere in their house. And some will read it every day. In a church, the priest will read out passages from it. What is the Bible? Okay, biblical studies is just the answering of the question, what is the Bible? When I read this whole book in my early 20s, I was blown away by it, because I'd never read it before. I'd gone through a whole school career. I'd had religious studies classes which nobody took seriously. Nobody told us to read any of it. And I'd even started a philosophy degree. And again, we were discussing learned philosophers like Descartes and many others, all of whom were grounded in Christianity, but we were never told to actually read the source book. I look back on my university tutors that first time around as deplorable, really. I mean, they were very poor. They were telling us to read Wittgenstein and stuff, but nobody said actually read the Bible. Okay, because it's like the key to Western civilization. or one of the keys. And when my own daughter went to university, I told her to read 3 books. One was the Bible, all the way through, before she went to Cambridge, which she did. The second was to read the whole of Plato, which she did, although she cheated a bit and didn't complete it. And then to read the whole of Homer. Homer's epics, the Odyssey and the Iliad, the Greek epics. So if you've read Homer, if you've read the Bible and read Plato, you're equipped, only then, in my opinion, to actually study at university. Should be like compulsory entrance. I mean, I wouldn't let any students come to study at my university unless they've read all 3. But anyway, I did it independently. But I did it as a scholar. So to read the Bible as a biblical studies scholar, you have to get a good atlas. You need to get maps, because it's all about very strange places, like in the Middle East, Palestine, Israel, Judea, places with funny names: Bethany, Bethlehem, Emmaus, Arimathea, Tyre, Sidon. What? Where are these places? You need to know, because you need a map to look at them. You need to know where Egypt is, because the Bible also takes part in Egypt. You need to know where the Tigris and Euphrates rivers are, which is what's called Mesopotamia. So you need to have a really good mind with an atlas and study where this Bible is set. Okay, it comes from this part of the world. Now, it was written originally. Okay, that's one of the first big questions biblical studies looks at. What was it written in? What language? Which letter forms did it use? There are some of the oldest forms of the Bible are in Hebrew, and a lot of the earliest parts, the books of Genesis and the what's called the Old Testament by Christians, refers to heroes of the people of the Holy Land, as they're called, Hebrews. There are 2 forms of alphabet. There's a Samaritan alphabet, and there's the square Hebrew script, which didn't come till much later, about the 5th century BC. And the Samaritan script is more curvy, and it's not the square script that we've got on the table in the next Roman Apollo. It's an older script. The earliest bits of the Bible were probably written with that kind of a curvy script called the Samaritan script. And that dates back to very early times when the alphabet was first invented by the Canaanite people who lived in this part of the world, on the coastal region. When they took to the sea, they were called Phoenicians. They had great trading ports called Tyre and Sidon, which had galleys going all over the Mediterranean, spreading the alphabet. And that's how the Greeks learned to write. And later the Romans, and then the rest of the West Europeans. We all learned because of these Phoenicians, or Canaanites. And Jesus was from that stock. He was a Canaanite, effectively. The Hebrews also learned to read and write from those same people. And they invented a variant of the script, And these things, and so did the Arabs much later. The Arabic script came from the same source. So that's a whole field within biblical studies. I mean, we could spend a whole class just looking at the history of the alphabet. I have a chart upstairs in Thalia with all the different early forms of the alphabet. And archaeologists have been discovering, embedded in, old archaeological digs, like tablets and sometimes clay shapes that have got alphabetic scripts written on. And it's really fascinating. I mean, that's a whole thing in itself. You can do a master's degree just in the history of the alphabet. And there are still many unanswered questions. I think one thing that we could say is that alphabetic writing was a bit of a revolutionary bombshell to the people of this region of the Middle East, because now you could put into one book, using the alphabet, all the legends, all the stories, all the histories, all the myths, in one easy to read thing, if you knew the secret of the alphabet. And that was taught in schools and by scribes who began to teach this. And the people that compiled what we now call the Bible by definition were literate, right? But we have to realise that there's a sort of prehistory of that literacy, because first in Mesopotamia they didn't use an alphabet. They used a cuneiform script, which we saw in the class on Babylonian religion, was sort of straight lines carved into clay. And the alphabet was an invention in about 1750 BC. I think I've pinned it down to about then. And that's the earliest archaeological traces. Now, what's interesting is, I mean, the Bible's a complex story, and I can't sum up the whole thing, but the first real hero to emerge, if you look at it like a storybook with heroes, a comic hero book, the first real hero to emerge is a guy called Abraham. And there's quite a lot about Abraham in Genesis. And it's about his wives, his travels, his faith, his God, you know. It's really the book of Abraham. Well, what's interesting is that Abraham lived about 1750 BC in exactly the same region that the alphabet was being invented. Well, when I discovered this, I thought, well, that explains it. That's why Abraham's the star of the story, because, like, his people invented the alphabet, which they then wrote down. And I always say to my students, in a sense, it's a sort of accident of history that the Bible should contain the legends and stories it does. If the alphabet had been invented in the island of Orkney, up in the way north of Scotland, where the Picts and Celts and Druids and stuff were doing their thing, and it could have happened, the Bible would be full of their stories and their legends. We'd be hearing about the Druid gods and the great adventurers that came from the sky, and, you know, we'd have a whole different Bible, because they would be telling about their great chieftain who had faith and believed in the gods and goddesses, you know, etc., etc. And likewise, anywhere that the alphabet had been invented, we'd be having their stories written down. So I'm trying to look at this scientifically as an explanation. The reason for the Bible being formed out of the stories it is because that was the epicenter of this alphabetic revolution, which spread literacy in a way that previous religions hadn't done. It democratized literacy. It's not that difficult to learn the alphabet. It's very difficult to learn ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs. There's thousands of them. You had to go to a temple school and study for years and years and join an elite group of scribes that were initiated into the meaning of all the signs. To learn the Babylonian cuneiform, likewise, you had to go to a temple school, initiated as a scribe. You'd do lessons in all the complexity of it all, and the pantheon of gods. I mean, that alone was incomprehensible to memorize, because they had myriads of gods. And not only that, but the Babylonians were using their cuneiform writing for numbers. They invented mathematics, and they had each god up to the first 60 was associated with a number. So you had to memorize all the numbers, all the gods, and then they invented the circle of 360 degrees, and they used 60 as their sacred number. 360 degrees is 3 lots of 60. And they used 12 as another sacred number, and that's why there are 12 hours in the day. Because they saw there are 12 months in the year, so that's obviously sacred to the gods. So the number 12 is a very important special god, right? And goddess. Now you had to learn all that, and that was a lifetime's commitment to be a scribe in a Babylonian temple. The Bible simplified it all, because the alphabet made it easy for ordinary blokes, carpenters, farmers, dishwashers, publicans, to learn about the gods. Before that, it was a really specialised thing. You were allowed to go to the temple, but it took years to even be able to read the scriptures, right? Now, everybody could read them. And that was so, therefore, that Abrahamic revolution was ultimately a democratizing revolution. That was the good news, but also to some extent the bad news of the Bible. It's a double-edged sword, because the good news is that everybody can read the sacred stories, and we can learn about how God created the world in 7 days, and it makes sense, and there we are. It's simple, sorted. The bad news is that it empowers people to think they understand without really understanding. So biblical literalists who read the Bible literally and then are prepared to go out and fight and kill for their literal reading of the Bible, that is a problem. And that's the problem we've got on planet Earth at the moment. We've got it in all different branches of Christianity. The biblical literalists of the Russian Orthodox Church under Putin and his patriarch, who used to be a KGB officer, think that it's literally okay to go and kill Ukrainians because they're not Orthodox. They're evil. They're Catholics. Oh, therefore we can bomb them and destroy them because they're Europeans, right? Well, this is bonkers. But it comes from this disease of thinking that because I can read in Russian Orthodox letters my Bible, and because I've got 1,000 years telling me that the Russians are God's chosen people, and only the Russians are, and only the Orthodox Church is the true Christianity, then I come up with a mindset that thinks like Putin and his patriarch Kirill, that, well, then we must go and kill the Ukrainians, because they're evil, they're not Russian Orthodox, they're Catholics, So that's the problem we've got, right? Okay, so, of course the answer is that if you truly study the Bible in a proper university or proper centre of scholarship, as I've done, you get taught that actually the writing isn't the whole story. Because you're taught the Kabbalah, and you know that that's the oral tradition that predated the writing that's the really important thing. And can you pass me that poster again, just to remind people? So then you come back to your Sephiroth, and you're given the tool to fully understand the Bible from within. And this is an oral teaching that predates the writing down of the Bible. Now you see, according to the Kabbalistic teachings, Abraham was a master of this too. He was doing a double service to humanity. He brought from the store of oral wisdom profound insights. I mean, he did understand that if you think each Sephiroth has got different gods and goddesses, like in the pantheon of the pagans, but they all make one energy system. Just as a human being, I have a liver, kidney, feet, hands, mouth, brain, and so on and so on. But I make up one thing, in my case called Thomas, one person. And that unity is really important. That's who I am. In Hinduism, we call that the Atman. That's the self within the self. That sense of, meanness that we all have, unless we're completely, mentally deranged. We all have, as Jung said, we need a secure self to act as a tree on which different life experiences can land, if you want. Anyway, this Sephiroth was the basis of the esoteric biblical tradition. And in Christianity, if you really, really study it in depth, as I've done, you'll find that Christ must have been versed in this tradition. He was obviously the inheritor of an oral tradition that was going around in his part of the world, as much as he was literate. We know that Christ was called a rabbi, which is the word for a teacher, right? He was trained to read the Bible in Hebrew, but he also had oral teachings that he was the recipient of. And for instance, he says, he astounds all the other rabbis. At one point, they're always coming after him for what authority have you got to be teaching like this? Where's your degrees? Which college did you study how to be a rabbi at? You seem to be a bit radical, talking about, ending poverty and equality in men and women, and everyone should love each other. That's heresy, isn't it? Where does your authority come from? Are you from the tradition of Abraham? Our founder, our master? And Christ had the cheek to say, before Abraham was, I am. What? that obviously blew their minds, because what Christ is saying in that is all that tradition you get from Abraham actually comes from a source, the I amness, the beingness of God, which is like the whole package, the Keter, married to Malkut, it's heaven on earth. And I'm coming from that same source. So the I am that manifested in Abraham or all the other prophets, well, it's manifesting now in me, that simple Jesus of Nazareth carpenter guy. Well, sorry, I've come out as a rabbi. And they really resented that how dare you go to the source and claim to be like coming from where Abraham was? Because, well, no, we have the authority to say who should do that. So it becomes, there's another element of biblical studies that's interesting. I mean, firstly, you need to have a degree in advanced psychology to read the text. Like, how did Jesus have the audacity to do all that and get away with it, even for 3 years? Why was he opposed so vehemently by the people in the establishment that were trying to crush him and ultimately crucified him? So to answer that, you need a psychology of resentment, of anger, and what I've coined the phrase Sophiophobia, the fear of wisdom. Jesus was trying to give too much wisdom to people. Like fishermen and carpenters and things like that. The poor. Well, that wasn't on, because the elites, in all civilizations, elites like to protect their elitism. We've seen this with Brexit, how the Etonians of Britain, the serious elites, wanted to do Brexit because too many normal European types were coming to live in Britain and enjoying it and doing this thing called democracy. Well, that wasn't going down very well with the elites, so they clamped down, because they're the wealthy ones, and did Brexit. And all their Etonian types are the people behind Brexit. Well, I'm a maverick member of the elite, but I'm also, I believe it's my duty to, uphold a principle that I think the Bible actually teaches, which is what I call spiritual democracy. A great Christian theologian called Nicholas of Cusa said, we're all equidistant from God. In an infinite universe, each point is at the centre, geometrically. And therefore we're all equidistant from God. He was a great theologian and a Roman Catholic cardinal from Holland, from a place called Cusa, and one of the greatest thinkers of the church in its long history. Right, biblical studies, so we need psychology. We also need sociology to understand the pressures, social pressures on peer groups, why people, fall out. We need to understand education. What was it Christ was trying to do? We need to understand archaeology to look at the history of the region. And I have a brilliant book called Jesus and His World, which is an archaeological study of the Holy Land, given to me by its author, Rami Arav, who's the head of archaeology for Galilee, or he was when I was visiting in the 90s. And they've gone in detail through Galilee, like archaeologically, sifting out everything. And they found bits of sandals, bits of old bone, like bits of old ovens. They can reconstruct what life was like in the time of Christ. And so archaeology is something else you need to know about. And occasionally they make stupendous discoveries. There was an ossuary, which is a bone container found in a tomb in Jerusalem, which seemed to have the bones of some of Jesus' family engraved on it. And it's still very controversial. Was it genuine? Was it a forgery? Did they fake it? There's still armed camps almost that take different views on that. We also need archaeology to understand and decipher the writing that's discovered, these stone slabs and things. And when I was young, I wanted to become